Thank you so much for making the time to come and listen to Ava and I, my colleague, who I think has just joined our Zoom call from the Global Assembly, to tell you a bit about the work that we're so my name is Susan. I'm joining you from Seoul in Korea at the moment. Unfortunately, it's 11 p.m. where I am, so I really hope that you're joining from a more civilized time zone than I am, but nonetheless, very happy to be here. I am originally from Seoul and 20 years old, and have been with the Global Assembly for the past 2 years. I think a good place to start is where I sort of became involved with this crew and really this global community that forms the Global Assembly team as it is today. And essentially, a year after high school, I decided to move to Madrid. And I had very low expectations of what this trip would be about, mostly looking forward to the tapas and to hopefully learning a little bit of Spanish. And I think it was a month before I went to Madrid that an auntie of mine introduced me to a friend that she had in Madrid. And this friend was Iago Bermejo, who runs Deliberativa, which is a civic participation lab in Madrid. And in one of our first conversations, Iago told me about an idea that he had, and it's what he described as a world citizens assembly. And the idea was quite simple. You gather a snapshot of what the human family looks like across the globe. So half women, half men, some non-binary folks. The 1% gets 1% representation in this idea that he called the World Citizens Assembly. And you have these people come together, learn from experts, and most importantly, each other, and curate solutions for the problems that affect them the most. And my first response to Iago was honestly to feel a little bit bad for the guy, because I couldn't, fathom that this didn't already exist. And I didn't want to be the person to break it to him that this novel idea that he was excitedly sharing with me, was something that surely, we as humanity should have been good enough to come up with by now, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the UN. And so I went into what can only be described as a Google search rabbit hole. And it was when I emerged from that search empty-handed, realizing that we weren't even close to realizing this common sense idea, that I think I sort of put aside everything else that was happening in my life and committed to being with this team for the past 2 years. And so that's where I start. But I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about what this actually looks like in practice. It's the first year that this is ever happening. And I'm thrilled to be here to just sort of share humbly how our team has been able to implement this along with our global community this year. And so with that short introduction, I'm going to start sharing my screen and walk you through a little bit of what creating a global citizens assembly has looked like this year. So I hope you are able to see the screen. And I wanted to start with the beginning. So my sort of confusion with the fact that this didn't exist was my personal start to this journey. But for this community, the start was really identifying the first missing piece, right? And the idea was simple. It was that there was a clear missing piece in the way that decisions are made currently at the global level. And that missing piece in the puzzle was us, right? It was everyday people being given an actionable and permanent seat in how decisions are made globally. And so our mission then was to give everyone a seat at what is the global governance table. But this year, of course, was the first year. And my confusion, of course, that this didn't exist yet, was sort of the start of the way that we're viewing this year and framing this year as a launch year and as a prototyping year. Because as far as we know, a global citizens assembly of this kind is being implemented for the very first time this year. And this year we held a 100-person version of this idea with a view to be able to scale up in the future. The vision, of course, is that this becomes infrastructure, that this isn't just a one-time event that we're running once this year. This is also not a campaign or just a civic voice project. Rather, the work that we're doing in the project for this year is really with the view to be able to create a new infrastructure or a new operating system for how decisions are made globally. We want, in the end, a global citizens assembly to become a permanent part, operating as sort of one node alongside other nodes, whether it's the United Nations or the World Economic Forum, in this ecosystem of global governance, as the node that provides civic intelligence in a permanent and long-standing way into this growing ecosystem. In doing this work, which is of course a mammoth sort of vision to be held, we're guided by a few values. And you're able to see, hopefully, some of our values on the screen, but I just wanted to be able to highlight a few of these and more or less flag them before we continue in this time that we have together. And of course, we've been through the first one, which is building infrastructure. And I think maybe the second one that I'll highlight is value number 4, which is that we're focusing on the means, not the ends. Ewa and I are coming from having been at Glasgow observing COP, where there were loads of people producing and proposing brilliant solutions for how we move forward as a humanity to address the climate crisis. At the Global Assembly, however, we believe that the most pressing solution or priority of our time is to come up with a better way of coming up with the solutions themselves. In the Global Assembly, we're providing a new process for how everyday people can come together and create their own solutions rather than proposing our own solutions, focusing on the means as opposed to the ends. And then maybe the second value that I'll flag, and it'll come up a little bit more as Ewa and I go through this presentation, is that we're emphasizing learning and practice, right? This is the very first time this has been done. And we are the first to admit that we don't have all of the answers. And so proceeding with humility and learning from iteration rather than ideology. So doing it, implementing it, learning from our mistakes, and then being able to build off of those learnings rather than simply what we think will work, is really at the heart of our implementing and delivery ethos of the project. And then in terms of the way the project is situated, we are also learning from our governance committees. And so we have 3 main governance committees that I'd like to flag. And the first of these is the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee. I think one of the key learnings we're taking from the other citizens' assemblies that perhaps some of you may have been involved with is that there must be a degree of separation between the process initiators or the core team and the folks providing the learning journey and information materials. And so the first committee that I'm excited to share with you is composed of scientists, but also Indigenous wisdom keepers from around the world who are providing that input of sort of knowledge and wisdom around the climate and ecological crisis, curating the information materials that our participants use as they start their deliberations. The second committee that I'd like to introduce is the Global Governance and Participation Committee. This is obviously the first time it's being done, and we're navigating a terrain that's perhaps never been walked before, how to incorporate citizens' voices in an infrastructure into this ecosystem. The GGPC committee can, I think, be best described as sort of our Sherpas in walking this journey and how to create smarter and more actionable ways of making this infrastructure permanent. And finally, the last committee that I want to introduce briefly is the Institutional Advisory Board. This project, I think, can be seen as coming at this point in time where we're sort of 20 years through, give or take, a story really that's been leading up to a global citizens assembly. If we saw the emergence of deliberative democracy in the 2000s, then in the 2010s, we saw national citizens assemblies, local citizens assemblies being implemented as this new forum to be able to bring a snapshot or mini public's voices together of everyday citizens. And we are really at the point where we're scaling this model up to the global level. And again, in doing that, we're coming up with new and sort of unforeseen ways of docking onto existing infrastructures. And so for this year, we're working with these institutions to be able to kickstart that process of building a new permanent infrastructure that's building on sort of the wisdoms that have been tried and tested in the past 20 years, working with these infrastructures to build this new piece of deliberative democracy. And so with all of that said, I want to get into sort of the meat of this presentation, which is that the Global Assembly for this year consists of 3 parts. And I'm going to be able to introduce the first part and then pass it on to my colleague Eva to walk us through the next 2. At the heart of the project for this year is the core assembly. And this is the scaled up model of that classical national citizens assembly. For this year, it's 100 people who form a descriptive sample of the global population representative by age, gender, education, and attitudes towards climate change, as well as geography. These members were not elected or self-selected, but rather they were selected by civic lottery, or what we know as sortition. And the core assembly has been deliberating since October 7th, recently to present their findings at COP26, and they'll continue deliberating until December. I think the key question that we get when we present the Global Assembly is, how is it done? And in many ways, the Global Assembly sort of lives in these granular details, logistical details of how this project is implemented. And I want to be able to walk you through a little bit of that in this presentation. The first question, I think, is how do we find these people, right? In a normal sort of national or local citizens assembly, you have something like census data or census registry data to be able to simply send out invitations, for instance, to addresses and run a final sortition with the folks who respond back. Of course, at the global level, there is no equivalent of a global census data. And so what we've had to do from the beginning of this process is rethink the way we design sortition as practitioners. And ultimately, what we've ended up with is a multi-step sortition to be able to find the 100 members of the first Global Citizens Assembly. And the first step started with pins dropping on a map, or what is the Global Location Lottery. So it was in June of this year that we used a NASA database of administrative districts around the world and use an algorithm weighed by population density to drop 100 pins on a map of the world. And these 100 points that you see on the map are where the assembly members of this year's core assembly is coming from. And I think the day that we ran the sortition, there were a few points that caught us off guard. For instance, Socotra, which as we Googled right after running the sortition is the most isolated landform on Earth. And the task then was for us to be able to find a participant from each of these locations, regardless of how politically fraught, how geographically isolated, regardless of the infrastructure problems that each of these points may have had. And so this was the homework ahead of us when we ran the first step of this process. And I think we knew from the beginning that within the core team, we would not be able to either find the means to be able to locate participants at each of these points, or 2, to really understand the idiosyncrasies and needs of each of these points. And so it was even before we ran the first global location lottery that we started building up what you're now seeing as the community of practice. And put short, the community of practice is a community of our partners from around the world a distribution list we've been building up since, I think, April of 2021, and scaled to around 170 organizations and individuals or volunteers around the world who co-create the Global Assembly with us as implementation partners. And it was knowing that we might not be able to find a co-working space or participant in Recife in Brazil, but for instance, our partners in the community of practice located in Sao Paulo May. And so it was this need to decentralize quickly and decentralize rapidly that started building up what would become our decentralized delivery model for this year, starting in the community of practice. And so I think when we ran the sortition, we already had around 100 partners to be able to start doing this work. And what the work looked like was starting to clearly delineate how we would work to begin with. And this is where the clusters were born. And for instance, where our friends Nick and Stacy at Community Organisers come in. And so what we did with these 100 points we had was divide them up into 10 regional or linguistic clusters. And so many of these clusters are, for instance, linguistically determined. There's the Anglophone cluster, which of course Community Organisers is leading, the Spanish cluster, Portuguese cluster, and then there are clusters that are delineated by longitudes. And for each of these groupings we were able to locate a regional or linguistically appropriate partner to lead the delivery of the project in these spheres of the world. And this is where in the point about having sort of localized knowledge available to deliver a global project comes in. And so it was really with this team of cluster facilitators, as they came to be known, that the Global Assembly that Ewa and I are presenting came into fruition. And more or less this community of cluster facilitators, what it allowed us to do was leverage this initial phase of decentralization to be able to then radically decentralize to what we sort of like to call unusual suspects. And so many of our cluster facilitators are people in the similar space as us, right? We have people who are experts in running deliberative processes. For instance, our partners in Colombia have been doing it for decades. We also have people who are skilled in sort of the research side of deliberative democracy, for instance, the School of Collective Intelligence in Morocco. And so these are the usual suspects who are able to sort of have the fluency in this project and in the work to work with us in this first level of decentralization. But what that community gave us access to was to be able to go out a step further and sort of ask ourselves, who is missing from the conversation? And that those are the community that ends up in this second level of decentralization. There are co-working spaces, there are libraries and schools, youth centers and women's centers who are not yet plugged in perhaps to global conferences like COP26. And these were the folks we wanted to be able to recruit, reach out to, bring into the project and activate in this work of creating a global assembly. And I think there were a few reasons in terms of delivery behind this, which is that one, it obviously paid the dividends in terms of providing localized knowledge. There are a vast array of idiosyncrasies at each of these points, whether it's what time of day is most suitable to meet. You know, is there lockdown at certain parts? Are there power cuts at certain hours of the day? It was these granular problems that we from our team could not even begin to comprehend, that we knew we needed to decentralize right down to the local level. But I think the second point, and one that really speaks to the ethos of the Global Assembly, is that we knew that this global project couldn't be truly global unless it was local first, right? We're running a global process where we're so, you know, we've seen from history how easy it is for these processes to sort of slip into a global north-centric paternalistic delivery model. And we knew that in order to avoid making a global north project, we just would not make a global north project, quite put simply. And so this is one of the reasons we wanted to decentralize as locally as possible. And so this is one snapshot. What you're seeing is the work that went in sort of during the summer with our global partners to be able to find those unusual suspects at the local level. open calls for anyone around the world who wanted to join. And of course, many of these folks who were on these calls were the usual suspects, people who are plugged into processes like this, working on the shared Miro board, which was our virtual version of sort of a war room, to be able to find those local co-working spaces, sports clubs, women's centers that were in a 200-kilometer radius of each of the 100 points or pins that were dropped onto the map. And it was around sort of August, I think, when we were nearing the deadline of, okay, we have to, pull the plug and move on to the next phase of the project, even though we had about 10 to 15 organizations we hadn't been able to find, for instance, in places like Myanmar and Uzbekistan and Syria, that everyone in our global community really stepped up. And every time we were about to pull the plug, someone would say, no, I found the community host. I've had some leads going. There are some cold calls going out. And ultimately, at the end of this process, we ended up with 100 community organizations near each of the points that were dropped on the pin. The next step after this small miracle that had already happened was being able to find the participants. And what this looked like was those community organizations, which we had recruited, going out into the street, doing on-street or door-knocking recruitment, and finding truly everyday people in a randomized sort of delivery model to be recruited as potential participants. And you can see a couple of examples of that on the screen. And finally, after about a month of open potential participant recruitment, we ended up with a pool of 675 potential participants. And it was with this pool that we ran the final step of the participant recruitment of the Global Assembly, running a stratified sortition to be able to find the final 100-member sample that was representative of the global population with those demographic criteria that I shared earlier. And so I think the key thing that needs to be flagged is that in normal deliberative processes, finding the participants is around, I think, 15%, give or take, of the bandwidth of how a process is designed. And then the rest, of course, is allocated to curating the information materials, designing the process. But what you see in the Global Assembly is that even getting the members to the table where their voices can then be heard takes up 60% at least of the bandwidth in delivering this project. Going through all of those political fraughtness of each of these points, the infrastructure problems, the inaccessibility of members at some of these locations. Again, I think underlining the need now more than ever to be able to bring those voices to the table and have them heard in deliberation with each other. And so this was the work that went on in the summer to get our members into the deliberation rooms. So I'll speed up a little bit. I think this graphic does a really great job of showing how the delivery model creates finally an assembly that is locally hosted and globally connected. And it's a shame that we sort of have to rush through this a little bit, but hopefully the slide deck will also be available after this presentation. I think it's a good time now to transition into the thinking and the process that went behind the design process. And again, this all harkens back to our values, right? For instance, the value of learning and practice. We knew that this hadn't been done before. And so it wasn't totally appropriate to apply and solely extrapolate from the experience that members of our team had had instead of national and local processes. And so what we did before the start of the assembly in October is ran iterative sort of pilot tests in the summer, running 8 sessions that mirrored what the sessions would look like in the actual core assembly with a smaller group of lab partners coming from 19 different countries. And it was through this process of learning and practice and essentially making all of the mistakes that we could in the summer that we were able to then iterate up to a model that we knew would work when the assembly kicked off in October. And you can see just some of these sort of ridiculously granular learnings that came out of this, whether it's how do people speaking 5 different languages use a Miro board together, which is what you're seeing at the left corner here. How are the ways that the people are going to be hosted differ depending on internet connection, language needs? we knew that a majority of the members were going to have to be accompanied by a translator from the community organization that recruited them. And so how would those computer setups look like? And it was each of these sort of very unglamorous but logistical points that went into the innovation necessary to make this a reality, and which we were able to test in the labs. And I think this is one good example of how unglamorous some of these questions can get. The first basic question for us in designing the process was, when are they going to deliberate, right? We have members who are located across every single time zone. When are they going to be able to meet and actually talk to each other? And ultimately, the final sort of design that came out of this process was a core assembly that's composed of 20 asynchronous breakout rooms that start at 5 a.m. UTC and end at 3 a.m. UTC on the next day. And they're composed of 5 members from 6-hour time zone windows. And it is only on Saturday that we've had to calculate more or less the most equitable 3-hour time zone window across the entire UTC time zone spectrum, which ultimately summed up to be 12 to 3 p.m. UTC, in case you're curious. And it's at these Saturday plenary sessions that all 100 members join. Someone from Korea, which is at the far latest end of the UTC spectrum, unfortunately for me, joining until midnight, and our friends from the West Coast of the US joining from 4 a.m. in the morning, doing this burden sharing to be able to meet across really time and space. And finally, this is, I think, a great segue to Ewa's segment, which is the information booklet. And this is the booklet that was curated by the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee containing the learning journey. And the main thing that I wanted to highlight before passing on to Ewa was the work that went into the translation process of these booklets. So the committee produced us with an English version of this booklet, but we have over 30 languages that are spoken by each of our assembly members in this 100-person assembly. And the only way we were able to truly translate these in a way that made sense to each of the educational levels, personal backgrounds, and language needs, whether it's the member needing an audible version of this material because they're illiterate, was to be able to, again, localize the translation process. And so what ended up happening was, in many of these locations, the community actually, whether it's the city or village of the assembly member, joined together in what was called an information material contextualization event, which is a name that doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but essentially to be able to review a translated version of a draft of the material and contextualize it, bringing in local examples and local initiatives to produce a translated version that was truly sort of curated to the needs of this assembly member, which I think is a great example that at each of these points, it took a village really to be able to curate this journey rather than a top-down delivery of a global process. And so at this point, I'm going to stop rambling and pass it off to my colleague Ewa to tell us a bit more about the 2 other parts of the assembly.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I hope that all of you can hear me well. There is a little bit of background noise. I'm actually in Ghana for the Ghana Digital Innovation Week, but usually based in Dakar, Senegal, and really happy to join you today and to be able to tell you more about the Global Assembly and specifically about the Community Assembly. Suzanne, I have some problem to open the presentation on my side. Don't know if you will be able maybe to share your screen and have the background slide for the Community Assembly. And the purpose really of the Community Assembly has been, how can we widen participation and be able to offer anyone to take part into the Global Assembly. And of course, we were quite aware that it will be hard for everybody to engage with it, and more specifically to engage through the core assembly. And we wanted to take the Global Assembly beyond the walls of the core assembly itself. So we have been working on developing a toolkit, a very accessible toolkit that will serve for all communities, all organizers around the world on Earth to be able to follow the same learning journey as the core assembly and offer a space to their community to be able to learn about the climate and ecological crisis, but also be able to discuss about it and connect with other community organizers from the world. So it's about bringing community centers, libraries, schools, hubs, all these different organizations that Suzanne was talking about earlier, but also being able to include other organizations, people that are living in the same neighborhood, in the same village, in the same city, people that are part of the same organization and doesn't have the chance to create space to discuss about that. Now I will maybe talk a little bit about firstly the resource and after that about the toolkit itself. Suzanne was mentioning to you about the information booklet that have been developed with the support of the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee, which is really allowing everybody to have access to the different evidence that are existing regarding the climate and ecological crisis, but also being able to have access to that in a more understandable way. And the translation that the different partners have been conducted was also a way for all of this material to be more accessible for the communities. In addition to the information booklet, there is the toolkit. And the toolkit really offers different processes. Of course, maybe some of you already know the process of the core assembly. It's a long process that have started in October and will run until mid-December, until December 18. But we were quite aware that it might be difficult for some of the community organizers, some community hosts on the world to be able to run such a long process. So we have developed other process, which is a 3-hour and 8-hour process, which is allowing anyone to convey 6 to 20 or 30 people, and to be able to use this guideline to facilitate their community assembly, to also have different guidelines that are helping them to use the contextualized material, but also to just create a space, a safe space where people from the same community are getting the chance to deliberate on that question. Something that is really interesting is the output that we will have through the community assembly will be collected and part of the report that we will be releasing in March 22nd, 22. And those outputs will be combined with the outputs that we will have for the core assembly. So it's a very interesting, because beyond hosting their own community assembly, the organizer have also the capacity to connect with other community organizers from around the world. And I think bringing this platform where people get the chance to connect, to share, but also to learn is one of the biggest and first results of this process, coming back to one of the core values that Suzanne was highlighting earlier, which is focusing on the means and not on the ends. I will now take a few more minutes, maybe to tell you a little bit more about the third part of the Global Assembly, which is the cultural wave. The cultural wave is really about finding the right way to bring everybody and to bring the creative industry, the creative ecosystem in engaging in the Global Assembly. So we have been launching a call to all artists all over the world for them to join us and to be translating what the climate and the ecological crisis mean for them using their art, whether it's poetry, whether it's artistic film, whether it's music, it's video, believing that the artists are are at the heart of how we want people to have access to information, but also how people are getting owner of these different material and be able to translate them in the best way that can be accessible to everyone. So Suzanne, I will hand it back to you. And thank you so much. Really happy to be able to share about these two components.
Thanks, Ewa. Nick, I think that was the end of our planned presentation. So I think I'm supposed to hand it back to you, Nick, to moderate a Q&A, if that's correct. Correct me if I'm wrong.